Love the branding behind you. Obviously, School of Port. Big fan.
Well, well, thank you.
You are in London. I'm over here in the States. So there is a time difference. So I do have to ask, are you in fact drinking port?
I do indeed.
Well,
There
cheers.
you go.
What kind of port are
Cheers.
you drinking?
So I am enjoying 2018 late bottle vintage by Dow's.
Oh, lovely.
Mm.
I'm not sure if you're familiar, Bartholomew Broadbent lives just over the way here in Richmond. And he
Really?
was kind enough, yes, and we had lunch this fall. He was kind enough to gift me some of his bottles. So that's what we are enjoying right now, a 10-year tawny.
10-year Tony of
Yes.
his own port.
A Broadbent selections, yes. So
Brilliant.
very
He's.
cool.
I'm looking forward to see the episode with him interviewing him. So
Yes,
that will
I'm ch-
be immensely insightful and exciting.
I'm
Knowing what
so
he.
excited because he's the ultimate port wine pioneer in the United States.
Yes.
That's kind of how I describe him. But you are the guest of honor right now, so we will dive right in. If you could invite one guest, living or dead, to a dinner party, who would you choose?
It would probably be the late Tim Stanley Clark, um, who is not really known outside the wine trade, but he used to be the absolute port connoisseur, uh, expert, and advocate and ambassador. Uh, Used to be the ambassador for the Symington brands that I also work with here in the UK, and he passed away in 2017. So before I actually joined the wine trade, so I never had the privilege of meeting him. But whenever I speak to colleagues in the wine trade, whether it's hospitality, in wine journalists who had the fortune to meet him, it's an overall positive experience. So everyone was delighted to be in his company, whether it's port or just generally in life. And he is the typical port character that I really look at him as my hero. And it would be a very long conversation about port and life and the Douro. So if there's one thing that I would wish for, that would be him.
I love that. Well, the fact that he reflects the Symington brand values is just wonderful because I adore the company, as I know you and I have talked about at length. Tell me more about your journey into port wine. So, you were not from London, but you are there now. So, what brought you to London? What got you interested in port wine and sharing it with others, specifically port wine?
So yes, my background is I was born and raised in Hungary. That's very Central Europe, and it has zero connection to port wine whatsoever. Strangely enough, I grew up behind the Iron Curtain. Um, Spent my teenage in the 90s in a very opening society that looks westwards, coming out from the doldrums culturally, um, and the very occupied and sort of like in people's thinking and mind was sort of limited in a way that opened up, and freedom was in the air. So my cultural background is that I grew up with the American culture at the time. So everything that's 90s in the US, I soaked it in like a sponge.
Do you have
Um,
a favorite pop culture reference from the time or a movie or something that resonated with you most?
Pulp Fiction. I grew up with it, and anything that was Quentin Tarantino, the early stuff, that was definitely resonating with me, as well as several actors and directors like Nicolas Cage, John Travolta. Fantastic education. That's how I learned English, pretty much, apart
That's
from going to
incredible.
school. But then from there, in my 20s, I was looking for somewhere else. I was just had that sort of sense of adventure that I wanted to see what's beyond the borders. I always read about it. I always enjoyed geography and travel literature, reading in general. Alongside port, my other vice is pretty much books, and to my wife's despair, I always buy more books than I can actually read. So we very quickly run out of space. So in my 20s, I just wanted to go somewhere where people speak English, and this was the closest option. Despite of my love of American culture, this little corner of Western Europe, England, was very easy reach. By that time, Hungary was part of the European Union, so basically, it was just like traveling to the next village. It's just a little longer travel. And then I ended up in London, unbeknownst to me, the capital of the wine trade. And at that time, I was my original profession is in hospitality, and that was followed by a career in property inspections, for which London, as a city of 10 million people who often rent their homes, was a lucrative career. But by the time we reached, I mean, wine has always been important to me in my life. And despite of Hungary is said to be a wine drinking nation, my parents were, if not teetotal, but very rarely drank. And wine has never been a major theme in our life. So everything I learned about wine was here in the UK, in London particularly. And I think it was my mid-20s. Up until that point, I wasn't really interested in wine per se. I knew about it. I knew that people drinking, but I never really, you know, never really caught my attention. But then, like for everyone, I had an aha moment after sipping a glass of wine, which was funny enough, that was a Hungarian wine, um, a beautiful red wine from the southern part of Hungary, a beautiful Cabernet Franc. That made me realize that there's a lot more to wine that meets the eye. And that started my journey. That's back in 2011 when I did my first wine educational course. And then all the career change happened. So wine always stayed in the back burner up until basically the pandemic. So it's fairly recent. When I was already thinking about changing careers. So hence wine for me is a midlife career change. And I thought it would be. I always read about wine. I always enjoyed wine tastings, etc., but never really thought it seriously. So I was missing the structured learning element, which I did during the pandemic. I did my next WSET course, and that just made me think about like how do people actually create the value in the wine trade, and how could I join this very interesting group of people? At least to my eyes, they were extremely interesting working with wine, from producer to actually the person who works in a retail environment. It's just they all work hard for us, for consumers. But there was no course for that, surprisingly. There was no course like how to be a wine merchant. So that the point came amid pandemic when I said to my wife that I would like to join the trade, and with her permission, I just turned from property guy to a wine trade person, and then that was a long journey. By the time
So,
I actually realized what I want to do,
so what was it about port wine specifically?
port wine specifically, and that was before I joined the trade, I believe, long before that. A lot of things in my life started with a book, hence the bibliophile character. And I read a book from Ben Hawkins. Actually, I can show you that because it's always at hand. Well, not always, but I'm in a room where I have all these books. And this was the book that I read. I think
Love
it's
it.
out of print now. It's Real Men Drink Port and Ladies Do Too.
I was going to say, do I need to rewrite this so it's real women drink a
No,
port?
and ladies do too. But the interesting thing about this book, this isn't anything technical about
Mm,
port wine. It doesn't talk about soy types, etc. It talks about the characters who work with port, the producers, the shippers, as they were called, about a generation and a half ago. Um, the people who sell, the work in the trade, talked about situations, about uh, emotions, what port evokes, and that really hooked me into connecting it with the otherwise fantastic drink in the bottle, uh, because we live in a golden age of wine drinking from a perspective of like 99% of the wine that you can find on the wine shelves in the US or elsewhere is a good quality wine that is, from a technical point of view, is perfectly made. So it's very difficult to differentiate between, like my wine is better than yours. it doesn't work that way. All the wines are very good. So how you relate to one wine compared to another, for me, it was this extra input from Ben. And as most things in my life, when I got hooked on a subject, more books follow and more courses and more meetings, and in this case, more tasting. And then before I knew it, I was running out of books and courses. And that's when School of Port came about.
So I do want to back it up and talk a little bit for those who aren't familiar with School of Port. So this is an educational initiative from Symington Family Estates, a fifth generation producer of premium ports. And School of Port, like you said, launched during the pandemic. And this is around the time when I launched the idea for Starboard. So it was actually brilliant timing because in my research, I was looking for places where I could learn outside of books. And I think what I love about School of Port, and highly encourage anyone to visit the website, take the essentials, I think it's the basics course, which I found to be a really wonderful immersive experience in terms of you get to know how port wine is made, the history, and you get a sense, I think, from the series that there's so much passion and love for this wine, and it's palpable. And I think that was one of my big takeaways from School of Port. But I'm so intrigued to know, from your vantage point, what's the best way to start to learn about port? If you know nothing, what do you think? How do you start?
I would say go to schoolofport.com
Yeah.
and start with the videos. But before even you do that, I mean, if you don't know what you don't know, it's very difficult to start.
Yes.
So let me start with the first part of the question, which was a bit about School of Port, which by the sound of it, you've been to our website because what you said
I'm
is
a big
absolutely
fan.
true. It's absolutely true. I mean, it started as a very small communications project during pandemic. That was before I even joined it. So originally, that was, as I said, the fifth generation Symingtons. To be particular, Rob Symington, who is now from this year, he will be the CEO of the Symington Family Estates. But he is the guy who sustainability is very close to his heart, and the traditions and how to make them relevant and how to keep port wine relevant, because that's as I said it before, in a distance it looks like a very traditional thing, but you can't really stay in business for centuries without constantly innovating and renewing yourself in order to stay relevant with the changing
And
times.
Coburn's has done a wonderful job of innovating with their packaging, with their ready to drinks. They've done a great job.
Yeah, and like this, coming up with new categories. So
Mhm.
LBV or Ruby Reserve, these categories didn't exist until the 1960s because no one cared.
Interesting.
Vintage did the job, and then that's what all we needed. And the entry level, mainstream, beautifully drinkable rubies. But that was all that the world seemed to be in need until the 60s, etc. So there were loads of change, and I think the School of Port is part of this change. That in sort of like towards the end of the first quarter of the 21st century.
Mhm.
Uh, During pandemic, when you feel like, oh my god, like the world as we knew it is over apparently, and then we can't really meet people, so what are we going to do? We've got technology, we've got online connections, so let's just do something that's like just to tell our our consumers like who we are and what we believe in and how we believe we should enjoy port. So it all started out on Instagram with a weekly School of Port talk. I still remember I only joined Instagram because I heard that School of Port is coming, and I thought, like, my God, it sounds so cool. Like School of Port, and like finally something more that I can find out about port. And that first interview was funny enough. That was with Rob and his father Paul, talking about 40 years in the tour. So basically, Paul giving us like a half an hour run through of what he experienced in his 40 years spent in the port trade and how the Douro changed. It was such a fascinating talk that I couldn't wait for the next one and the next one. And it really got me hooked on School of Port at that time. There were more coming up, some with the family members, some with other port producers like Inter de Tedo, and Odile Bouchard, which the Quinta do Tedo is a fantastic small quinta in the Douro with a very interesting French and American cultural mix in Portugal. You should have a look at them. They are brilliant as a family. So all these fantastic characters came to life on Instagram, and then it continued with setting up our website and started to collect information for the benefit of everyone, and it's all free of charge. So all you have to do is just register. And the entire mission behind School of Port is basically demystifying port wine. When I came into it, is that I constantly emailed them and bombarded them with the silliest questions you can imagine, because I wanted to know everything. That's a learning curve. I was lucky enough to join a fantastic wine merchant here in London, Davis, who are, again, just like the Symington family estate, they are family owned and currently fifth generation led. They are in business for 155 years now almost. But they have wine bars all over the city of London, as well as they import their own wine. So they do wholesale, retail, the lot. So that gave me the opportunity of actually discovering where I could be, where I could fit in. So where would my skills create the most value? Should I become a salesman? No, I shouldn't. Should I become like a retailer? I absolutely enjoyed. I just felt like it's not, you need to scale it up, because I love to do it one by one to help people discover what they want to drink. It's not just port, do anything else really. But it's fascinating, but I felt the need that we need to scale it up. And I was lucky enough to have a manager at the time who she threw me into everything that came my way, including after 2 weeks asking me if I wanted to do a wine tasting. I had no idea how it was done, but I said yes, of course. And I did my preparation, and it was a fantastic Italian wine tasting for 10 people in the wine bar. And I think something clicked there. I realized that there's, I have a lot to learn. That was a quick realization, but I also felt I truly enjoyed myself. I was in the flow, and that was pushing me towards like running more and more masterclasses within and outside Davis later. And then by the end of 2022, I was perfectly hooked on School of Port, and I started to miss the fact that it would be so nice to actually taste port while learning about it. So I just asked the question, like, guys, would you consider running a School of Port masterclass in the UK? And they said, yes, of course. Just tell us who's going to run it.
You said
And I
me.
said, yes, I think that would be me. And incredible faith and trust that they put in me. I organized the tasting. It wasn't really the best. It wasn't really the most successful. It wasn't really like an audience of 100. Yet it proved one thing, that if we put our minds into it, then it can actually work. So 2023 was the first year when School of Port is leaping off the computer screen, at least here in the UK, and starts to meet the consumers. We organized outside the UK, that were the Douro Zom camps for 3 years in a row, for 2020 through 23 and 24. Where we invited ambitious, young, smart sommeliers from all over the world, US included. Actually, we had some fantastic American participants, just to come and join us in the Douro for 4 days and just taste and eat the heart out of Porto and the Douro. And you can imagine the suffer, but they really, really enjoyed the experience with us, and we hope to continue that in the long run, because that's what we feel is how you break the mold, is that if you show people that port is a lot more than you actually thought of, and that was a very, very long partial answer to your question, because I still haven't helped you out like how you would introduce it to the US consumer.
And we will get into that. But I do want to touch upon when you are introducing people to port wine. In our conversations, we've talked about how it's less about teaching people about, the terroir and how it's made and things like that. It's really has a lot to do with the story. And you really love the story of port. Is there a particular piece of the story of port that resonates most with you, that's most exciting, that you find most compelling?
It's not just the story. I mean, there are certain parts of the story of port that resonates with me. Most of the characters that through port I can meet, and it's the human element of how port becomes, and wine in general, by the way, the connection between two people or more. I think it's when introducing ports to people, it's more about the people that you are introducing the port to, because port has 50 different shades. It has such versatility that gives us professionals and consumers a fantastic choice to personalize port wine. I know that you always want to figure out in your podcast what would be the best port for the US consumer,
I know. That keeps me up at night.
but then I don't think that, that the thing is that people from different cultures and people are very individual, and culturally they hook on to things from a different perspective. So there is no one answer to it, and that's the beauty of port, because that can provide you 1,000 answers.
But I did want to circle back on the best entry level for the American audience, what style, because this will be a pop quiz for you, Adam, because I did ask this question to School of Port and they provided me with an answer. So I'll ask you, if you had to pick a style of port to be the
I should have
entry
done my
level.
I
Yeah.
should have done my homework. What my colleagues
So I'm curious what you think, if you had to choose a style, what would be the best entry level for Americans?
just understanding how people approach wine, I would normally go for fruity as opposed to barrel aged, which is more nutty, which is more caramelly. So if there's a general answer to that, I would go for a good reserve ruby. So without going into
Ding,
very
ding,
much specifics,
ding.
grams 6 grapes is the best way to introduce people to the intricacy of port, because even at an entry level, that offers you such a complexity that it just blows your mind and say like, oh my god, all this flavor in just one sip of wine. How can that happen? Say that there is no such thing as right or wrong pairing. As long as you enjoy it, it's
Right.
right. It doesn't matter if it's written in the 101 ultimate how to pair your wine with food book. It doesn't matter.
And
What
I think
works for
there's a
you works for you, and
exactly.
that's true to port. So basically, if there's one thing that you have to remember about School of Port, is that our number one rule in drinking port is that there are no rules.
And I think that is the message that's most important to get across, especially to Americans, because wine is intimidating. Port wine, fortified wines are especially intimidating. So, how do you lessen that?
There's a caveat to the part no rules, and that's why someone needs to go to schoolofport.com and have a look at us for a couple of short videos, because there are certain practices that would help you to make the most of sort of enjoying your port wine, because otherwise you would just listen to the old convictions of like, red wine must be served at room temperature. But then here comes the problem that this rule was invented before central heating altogether. So what we call room temperature now is way too hot for any wine, let alone one with 20% alcohol. So all you would feel is the burning sensation of alcohol and nothing else. And then you would say like, oh my God, port wine is, but that's not true.
Right.
These are the things that's not a rule. It's just more like a helping guide
It's a
to understand.
guardrail. It's a guide to, there are no rules, but here are ways to make port even
Yes.
more enjoyable. And actually, how would you approach introducing Americans to port wine?
This is like, I only have a lawyer's answer. It depends. And I know that you are looking for the ultimate answer, and I wish I could give you that, because then that means that I would make a fortune overnight, solving the biggest question of the trade as of now. But for me, Americans are a free-spirited nation. And when I look at port as a category, and when I think of my time spent in the Douro, where port originates, I can't imagine a more rugged, wild, yet immensely free place. You just smell the rawness and the freedom of the Douro. And if you know, like I would take every American to visit the Douro at least once, and that would
We're
absolutely
going. It's like the
convert.
number one tourist destination. It has been consistently, and more people are going to Porto. My in-laws were there last year.
Porto is
It's
a very
happening.
good start, but then
Mhm.
the Douro itself, where it's not just the most breathtaking uh, wine region with 55% of the steepest vineyards in the world concentrated in the Douro. Steepest means it's 30% and more. It's a very steep place, and no picture give its proper. It doesn't do justice. You really have to go be there for yourself, and once you're there, you would feel that immense sense of connection with nature. And it always reminded me of how the United States as a nation was founded, in terms of you are free to do what you want to do, but you have to accept the consequences and the responsibility for your actions. It
As
was
they say,
and
you deserve who you vote for. That's what we say over here.
I think we should avoid politically. When I grew up, the American way was, if you are best at something, you just go at it and you will make it happen. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter your circumstances. You are the master of your fate. And that's very much how the port trade came to existence in the first place. And if we can actually show to people what the magic of port wine, and what an exceptional amount of work, care, and nurture goes into making even the entry level port wines. They would touch it differently, and they would immediately forget about, like, oh my god, it's alcoholic, so I might get drunk. No, you would think about, like, my God, there were two generations nurturing this 40-year-old port. So I think I should approach it with, like, my God, it's like my grandfather passing it to me. Like, this is my gift to you, and go and enjoy it. And then you would not feel the urge to rush to drink it fast. You would just
I'm
savor
going
it.
to ask you my closing question, which of course we know the answer to is do you drink port? But specifically describe your ideal scene. What are you drinking? Who are you drinking it with? Set the stage for us.
Well, as I said, School of Port says, drink port everywhere and anyway. So there are fantastic memories I have from all different scenarios, from the wildest scale, as I said, from winter to summer to spring to autumn. But if I really am forced to pick one, I would say the favorite moment is being in the Douro, in a quinta, on the balcony, overlooking the river, and have your port at the ready and just listen to the absolute silence, and just soak in the Douro. I mean, that's and once you visit the Douro, every time you touch a glass, you somehow feel that, even if you're in the middle of a busy global city like London. And that works in every season. That I've seen the Douro in all seasons, and the only thing that changes is the port in my glass, but the scene is pretty much the same. If it's summer, it's most likely that's my white port and tonic, or just white port neat, or a super chill Tawny. If it's spring or autumn, I think the Tawny stays. That might bring in some late bottled vintage, or a Ruby Reserve. And if it happens to be the winter, where the Douro is still absolutely beautiful, a bit chilly, but and a bit wet, but it's still beautiful. So that's when the vintage port comes alive. And then winter is quite slow, because this is when, like, the nature seems like it's asleep.
I
And
love
then
winter
this is
though.
when you really feel like you're slowing down.
Yeah.
And then vintage being probably the most complex category within port, that is the time to savor it. Uh, but that being said, there are no rules. So I've been seen to drink my white port neat in the middle of the winter. So I'm rebellious in that sense. But my favorite spot to enjoy port would be in the Douro.
And I love how you mentioned that because you have such a deep connection with the Douro Valley that every time you drink port, it kind of brings you back, it transports you back there. And I'll close with this because I just think this is what makes wine in general so special, is it's so intrinsically tied to place. And you can remember there's certain drinks you've had, and of course food, that you remember where you were, and they can bring you back to that place. And I think that's what makes port so special. And I know one day I will get to the Douro Valley and experience the magic of it. And I'm sure that I'll be sipping wine after port specifically and thinking about being back there. I love that.
I'm looking forward to have a glass of port with you.
In person, yes.
In person, in the Douro.
Cheers.
Cheers to that.
Thanks for listening to Drink Port, a podcast from Starboard. Interested in being featured? Visit starboardwine.com/podcast to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter so you can join the venture to a new port. Cheers and drink port.